Let me take you through the setup for this scene. We've got a mirror on the floor, and that is really what it all centers around. Sophie is going to look into the mirror, and then that's going to get reflected into my camera lens. But also reflected in the mirror is this background. Now, the lighting for this entire setup is just 2 flashes. I've got a key light down here lighting Sophie, and a fill light just filling in everything else. The final picture looks like this, but of course it didn't just happen, so to get here, let's rewind and break it down. To help me out today, I've got the amazing Sophie. Sophie's going to be the model for this photo session, and as everything revolves around the mirror, we're going to start with what it's there for, because normally you would ask your model to look at the camera, but the way I've framed this, Sophie isn't looking at the camera directly. She's looking at it indirectly in the mirror. So Sophie, if you can look at the camera through the mirror, this time it makes sense. So that's the first thing I need to explain to Sophie is this is an indirect portrait session, which is going to affect everything we do from now on. Next thing I need to think about is the depth of field, because remember, I'm not photographing Sophie, I'm photographing the reflection of Sophie, and that has depth. So I need enough depth to focus on Sophie's reflection and the surface of the mirror. So I'm going to dial in some settings which I hope will work, but I'm also happy to change as we go along. I'm going to start with my flash sync speed. That's 250th of a second for my camera. I'm going to choose f8, but you might need a smaller aperture depending on your camera setup. And then ISO 200, the native ISO for my camera. No flash in manual mode gives me this, no picture. Now I've got shadows in my picture, I can light them with my own lights. So let's start with this, which is just going to be a fill light. Now, this is the secondary light, but I'm doing it first for 2 reasons. Partly because it's just going to give me a wash of light, but mostly because the key light on a reflection is really hard to do, so I'm going to do the easy one first. Now, the right setting for this, I don't know. I'm going to guess maybe 1/16th power, middle of the power range. It looks like this, which is something on the picture, but not a lot. I think we can get away with a little bit more light. So let's go up 1 stop to 1/8th power for that flash. The light's just bouncing around the room and then coming down. So it isn't particularly bright, but it's also non-directional fill light. Basically, these are the darkest shadows I can expect to get in this setup. So at this point, I'm ready to do a test photo of just this lighting setup and the mirror on the floor. So Sophie, if you can just sort of lean in towards it so you're looking down into the mirror and then up into the camera. So this is the sort of pose we're going for at the end, but there's a few things I need to fix. Let's start with the position of Sophie in the mirror. I could move her around, but we're on a really tight amount of space, so I don't have a lot of choice. I could move myself around, but then I'd end up with even less background in the picture. I'm actually going to move the mirror. Now, I don't want to move it physically, just in angle. So I have got a spare battery for my Flashpoint Evolve flash. I'm going to tuck it underneath the mirror, just like that. So that's going to angle the mirror up a little bit more, which should move Sophie back down the length of the mirror. That's my plan. Let's see if it works. Sophie, if you can just take up the same pose again. Yeah, it completely did. Sophie is now roughly in the middle of that mirror. And now I've got even less background in my picture. To fix this, I'm actually going to angle the background down. So effectively, what I've made is a little tent for Sophie to sit inside. Now, that's not there to keep her nice and cozy. It's simply because when I look in the reflection from this angle, that's what I can now see fully reflected. So none of the ceiling above me, just the fabric of the background above Sophie. Now, will that affect this light? Yeah, probably will a little bit, but let's see if it's enough to make a difference that I need to change anything. Okay, Sophie, quick little test photo. And the short answer is, it has affected it a little bit, but I'm still happy with that as a fill light, which means we're ready to add in the second light, the one I was avoiding. So what I've done is I've got a second light, which is another Flashpoint Evolve 200. I've got it set low because it needs to light Sophie, but I don't want to put it so low that it's actually uplighting Sophie. There may be a bit of that because light is going to bounce off the mirror. There's not much I can do about that, but it's a balance between those two things, and I think this is going to be okay. I've also put a grid on the light, mostly just to stop it spreading too randomly and give me a little bit of direction to the light. Now, to get the correct exposure of f8, that required me to be at half power, which is getting close to where I would like to be as a maximum. However, I think it's going to work okay. Let's take a test photo, see what we've got. Right, there's two things I need to change straight away. The first one is the position of the light, because it's in my picture, and the second one is the position of the light. It's too flat. So if I move the light over to the side, it's going to get it out of my picture, but also it's going to give some shadow and shape to Sophie's face. And I think that's going to help quite a bit. Well, let's find out. Oh, important point. I haven't really changed the distance. It's still roughly the same distance from Sophie as it was before, which means it's roughly the same power as it was before from Sophie's point of view, which should mean I get the same exposure, roughly. Now we're nearly there, just a few things to change, and the first one is what we do with Sophie, because at the moment she's in quite sensibly a comfortable position. But Sophie, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to get you a little less comfy. Can you just sort of fold your arms and come down? There you go. Now, by getting Sophie lower, it puts her lower down in my frame. Let me show you what happens. And that just makes more sense as a picture. Now I know I'm going to flip this picture around in post-production, and we'll talk about Photoshop in a little bit, but for now, this is basically the setup done. So I've got a few different mirrors to try. We're going to try a few pictures. Sophie, are you ready? Let's take a few photos. If you want to try this at home, just change a couple of things and this whole setup becomes unique and yours. But if you want to try one thing, just change the mirror. You don't need an ornate mirror. Maybe a round one or maybe a square one would work well. So I'm going to try a couple of different shapes. The very first thing I'm going to do here inside of Photoshop is go to Image Rotation, and rotate it 180 degrees. Now, it doesn't matter what software you're using to edit your photos, this is how I intended the picture to look, so it's going to be the first and potentially the only thing I do. Because now, this whole reflection makes so much more sense than it did before. And the fact the floor is falling away in reverse just adds to that feeling of unease, which is exactly what I wanted. So everything now is optional, and the first thing I want to do is, well, remember I said about getting the depth of field right, because the reflection has depth and I need both Sophie's eyes to be in focus and the mirror. Well, I maybe went a little bit too far because I've also got the top of Sophie's head in focus. I don't really think I need that. So let's go up to Filter and go to Blur Gallery, Tilt Shift, that'll work perfectly. Tilt Shift allows me to put a controlled blur that is adjustable and adds a realistic feel. And I really just want to blur the top of Sophie's head like that. I think that's pretty much bang on. That definitely feels like we've got some depth going on. So when you're happy, click OK. Now, I think a bit of color in here would work quite well. I like the red and the blue and the browns, but I want to shift it a little bit more unreal. So to give that slightly retro vintage feel, I'm going to come down to the little black and white circle here and choose the color lookup adjustment layer. Now from the properties, I'm going to change the load 3T LUT into, well, there's loads. I could choose, not that one. That's actually quite nice. Not what I want, but I actually quite like that. Futuristic bleak is one of my favorites, and the future isn't that bleak. Let's take it down to about 50%-ish. Yeah, that's pretty good. And that works so well. Let's repeat that with another color lookup, and this time I'm going to change it to tension green. Again, maybe not that strong, so let's take that down to, yeah, 30-ish%. Now that works with the color shift and the washed out look, but the contrast feels a little bit out of sorts. So back to the black and white circle, brightness and contrast, and I'm going to increase the brightness there. Yeah, about there looks good. And a bit of contrast just for fun as well. There we go. That feels pretty good. Now there's a few other minor tweaks and adjustments, mostly probably cloning out dirt and things from the mirror that I should have cleaned properly at the time of the photography. But there you go. There is my final picture completed. Oh, there's one last thing I should have said. The selection of Sophie's red dress, the color of the wooden floor, this background, none of that happened by accident. It was all part of the planning. And if you want to find out more about the gear I'm using, for example, this background from Manfrotto, you'll find links to that in the video description down below. Whilst you're there, might as well click on the thumbs up button because you've made it this far into the video. I guess you've enjoyed something. And of course, you've probably already done so. But if by chance you haven't clicked on the subscribe button, well, now's your chance because we have loads of great content right here on Adorama TV really regularly. I'm Gavin Hoey. Thanks for watching.